In this video, we're going to get more practice at writing beats into scores so that you get more used to that. This time we're going to use Brahms's Lullaby, again from my intermediate classical course. This piece has more eighth notes in it, like here and here, and that means we're going to have more offbeats to count, so we'll get more practice at that than we did in Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Well, first thing to check, if we look at our note lengths chart, which was in a previous tutorial, if you haven't already downloaded and printed this, or if you're finding this video online somewhere out of context, do follow the link in the description below. Find your way to this website, musiphone.com, and download and print off this chart. It's very useful. So here is a larger version of it. In this chart, the fourth column is true if we follow this asterisk, if the bottom number of the time signature is a 4. So that's a bit of a strange sounding rule. It'll get explained in a later tutorial on time signatures, but for the time being, you just need to know that if the bottom number of the time signature is a 4, then this column on the right is true. So if we go back to Brahms's Lullaby, we can see that the bottom number of the time signature is a 4, not the top number, but the bottom number, which means that this column on the right is true. And specifically, it means that this note, a quarter note, is 1 beat. So a note with the head filled in and a stem is going to be 1 beat in this piece. So this is a quarter note, this is 1 beat. And if we now look at the entire left hand of this piece, we can see that the left hand is entirely made up of quarter notes, just a long string of quarter notes, which are 1 beat each. So the left hand is entirely made up of 1 beat long notes, which really simplifies writing the beats into the bars, because we can straight away put in beat 1 here. So going back to this tutorial, so a couple of tutorials ago, I laid out these 3 rules about reading rhythm which are true for all pieces. And the first rule was the first note after a bar line is always on the first beat of the bar. So this is the first note after the bar line, so that's going to be beat 1. And then the next rule was the length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. Well, this note is 1 beat long, and it's happening on beat 1, so the next note is going to come on beat 2, because this is 1 beat. So this is going to come 1 beat later on beat 2. This is another 1 beat note, so this will come 1 beat later on beat 3, and so on. 1, 2, 3, and we can do this in every bar. I'll just write in the beats for the first line, but you could do it for the whole piece. Again, I'm writing with a trackpad, so my handwriting is terrible. I promise I write better in real life. Okay, it's not a very good 3. So that is where the beats go on line 1 of Brahms's Lullaby. And that is following the left hand. It's because the left hand is very regular. The right hand, however, is very irregular rhythmically. So the left hand is entirely made up of 1 beat notes, but in the right hand, that's a 1.5 beat note, half beat note, 1 beat note, 2 beat note, and so on. We'll go over all of that a bit slower in a moment. But the great thing is that because of this rule, the third one, if 2 notes are vertically above each other on the staff, they're played at the same time. It means that we just have to work out the beats for one hand, and we know that where the beats go for the other hand. So again, to recap the rule, if 2 notes are vertically above each other on the staff, they're played at the same time. So for instance, this note and this note, these 2 are vertically above each other, so they get played at the same time. We know that this note here gets played on beat 3, which means we also know that this note gets played on beat 3. In other words, we worked out when this note gets played without even having to work out how long these notes were. Usually we have to work out when a note gets played based on the previous notes. That's rule 2. The length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. So usually we know when this note is happening based on the length of the previous note and the length of the note before that. But in this case, once we've worked out the beats for the left hand, which is completely regular, we can know when to play the right hand notes, simply by comparing them to the left hand. So this is a pretty common occurrence and a very useful trick in working out beats in bars. It is very common in pieces that you have an accompaniment which is extremely regular and then a melody which is rhythmically irregular. A completely rhythmically regular melody wouldn't be very interesting. So that is a very common setup. And when that happens, you can simply use the left hand or the accompaniment to work out where the beats go, and that will really help you work out when you play the notes in the melody. So the beats are always the same for the right hand and the left hand, because the right hand and the left hand are vertically aligned. So that actually really simplifies most of the notes in the right hand, we know when this note gets played, it gets played on beat 3. We didn't even have to calculate that this was a 2-beat note or anything like that. We just have a few more notes to work out. We have some of these offbeat notes to place, and then we have these 2 notes at the beginning. So let's start with these 2. So here we don't have anything on the left hand as a guide to when the beats go. Instead, we have to look at this thing, which is a rest. Now, rests are going to get covered more thoroughly in a later tutorial, but they are on the note length chart. They are the second column of the note length chart. And if you look at the second column, you can see that we have a couple of symbols here, which we recognize here. That's these 2 symbols. And as I said, we'll cover rests in detail later on, but a rest is basically a symbol telling you not to play anything for a certain period of time. So the symbol for rest changes depending on how long the rest is, just as a symbol for a note changes depending on how long a note is. But all of the rules in this previous tutorial also apply to rests. So every time I wrote the word note in these rules, I put an asterisk and said or rest. So for instance, this first rule is the first note after a bar line is always on the first beat of the bar, but that note could also be a rest. So also the first rest after a bar line is always on the first beat of the bar. So going back to Brahms, this is the first rest after the bar line. That's going to go on the first beat of the bar. And then we need to know how long this rest is to know when to play this note. This is quite a lot of thinking through. There's another way we could do this. We could have done it backwards, starting from the bar line and working backwards, knowing that there are 3 beats in the bar. But let's do it this way, just so we understand rest notation. So this is basically it's kind of a horizontal rectangle sitting on a line. This is a rectangle dangling from a line. See, they're different. This one's sitting on a line. That one is dangling from a line. Pretty wacky notation, but that's what they decided at some point in music history. So going back to this note length chart, the one we're looking at is sitting on a line. It's this one, not dangling from a line. Sitting on a line, and that is a half note rest. So it's 2 beats long in this piece. So this rest is 2 beats long. Again, double check it on the graph if you don't believe me. A rest sitting on a line is 2 beats long. So this is going to occupy beats 1 and 2 in this bar, and then this note's going to come in on beat 3. So there's a 2-beat long rest taking us from beat 1 to beat 3. This note gets played on beat 3. These are 8th notes. So on the chart, it's basically 2 of these joined together. If you remember that music notation was originally handwritten, if you wanted to write a bunch of these in a line, it was a pain writing a single tail for every single one. So when you had 2 of them together, they simply joined the tails together like this with a beam instead. But it is, this note is the same length as this note. These 2 notes are basically just 2 of these joined together, and the tails get joined like this. So these are half-beat notes, which means that this note is coming on an offbeat halfway between beat 3 and then beat 1 in the next bar. And we notate offbeats with a plus sign, and we're going to pronounce that and when we count it. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, and 1. And this is going to go on the and. Then we have another offbeat note here. So we can kind of see visually that this note's going between beats 2 and 3. But let's just double check that we know exactly where this note goes. This note here is a 1-beat note, but with a dot after it. And as we discovered in Beethoven's Ode to Joy, if you put a dot after a note, it multiplies the length of a note by 1.5. We're going to go into that in more detail in a later tutorial on dotted notes. But that means that this is a 1.5 beat note. So it's going to take up all of beat 1 and then half of beat 2. So then this will come halfway through beat 2, between beats 2 and 3. So we put a plus sign under that, which means and we'll count that 1, 2, and 3. So next bar, we have another offbeat note here. This is the same rhythm as we had here. So this note's on beat 3, then we have another note half beat later, just as here we had a note on beat 3, another note half beat later. So we can work that out just by comparing it to the previous example. It's going to be 3 and 1, 2, 3, and 1. Here we have another note that looks like it's on 3 and. We can double check it. It's coming after another 1.5 beat note, just as we had here. So this is going to take up all of beat 2 and then half of beat 3. So this note is going to come halfway through beat 3. And then lastly, this is exactly the same as this and this. So that's 3 and again. So a bit messy. This would look much better if I was handwriting it. which is what you can do. I recommend, if you're doing this exercise, printing off a score and writing these beats in pencil. And if we now count through the first line, it'll go like this: 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, and 1. So 1 will be on the next line. We will go into sort of counting with a metronome in a later tutorial, and how to implement this and actually allow the counting to get you to play a tune in time. The only thing I will point out for the time being is that you basically write in all of the beats. So here we have 3 beats in a bar. It's kind of obscured by red at the moment. That's the top number. We have 3 beats in a bar, so as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 in every single bar. And we always write the beats in, but we only write in the offbeats if there is a note on an offbeat. So we're not writing in an offbeat here or here, because there's nothing happening on the offbeat. But when we do have a note on an offbeat, write in the plus sign to indicate an offbeat and count it with the word and. 1, 2, 3, and 1.